Thanks everyone for being here this morning. And um, you guys know that Zack was supposed to be our guest artist for Tubaphonium Day this year, and I'm glad that we at least got one run at David and Goliath in after all that work that we did.
Yeah.
But at Tubaphonium Day, he was going to do a master class on combining tuba with electronics. Um, so I thought it might be kind of fun for us to hear what he's done, what he is currently doing, and this way you guys can ask questions about combining your instrument with electronics and ask, about hardware and software and all that kind of stuff. So I'll turn it over to you and let you go from there.
Awesome. Well, hey everyone. Good morning. Good to see you all. So I just wanted to start off with saying a little bit about tube and electronics. I feel like a lot more people are starting to combine these, and not just tube and electronics. I think that over the board, a lot of people are starting to combine with either live effects or that they're working with tuba and tape. And it seems to be working pretty well, especially for people doing recitals when they're traveling and such like that. And instead of having to take a pianist along with you or something like that, you can, take electronics, which works a lot better. And it's, you get to keep more of the money that way too. But I wanted to start off first with just like a brief, I guess, introduction to like equipment and stuff like that. I figured that might be a good way to start off and just make sure that we're all on the same page with what's going on. So I'm going to screen share the PowerPoint. Here we go. Everyone can see that? Yep, cool. Alrighty. So we're going to start at the very beginning. And when I was writing this up, I was like, oh man, he's going to be the guy that talks about cables for like 2 minutes and stuff like that kind of boring thing. But I think it's very important because in my experience, through a lot of failure and a lot of testing, I've realized how important it is to have the proper equipment and make sure that it all works together and fits properly, instead of just trying to plug stuff in and hope for the best. So I wanted to just start off with the very beginning. We've got 1/4-inch cables, mono versus stereo. And mono just means that it has a positive charge. So on the left, or yeah, I guess it would be everyone's left, just a positive charge, which means that you only get one side. You don't have two sides. And that's the example, let's see, example A here. Yep. Oops, sorry, did I mess those up? Unbalanced, yeah, sorry. So the mono is actually example B. That's my bad. You see, actually, let me get the, here we go. I just learned this handy trick the other day. Can everyone see my select button? Does that work? Cool. All right, so as you can see here, this is the mono, the unbalanced, and it has one single strip, which is very important because if you're plugging into a mixer or an amp and it says mono or stereo, many of them have different outlets. It's very important that you get the correct one. And so the opposite would be the balanced here, the stereo system, which is a positive and negative charge. The next part, and one of the most important things I think for tuba that I want to talk about would be the microphones. So there are there are three distinct types of microphones, and then there are like categories within that. But the two that are most common and most affordable for us are the dynamic and the condenser mics. So I like to think of dynamic mics as vocalists, like you hear it at karaoke. It's kind of high pitch frequency, whereas the condenser mics actually compact the sound and have a lot more range. So they get a lot more of the lower stuff, which works better for us. They are a bit more expensive. You can find them around 150, but they can go all the way up to 3,200. And whereas the dynamic microphones, you could probably get those with any karaoke set, and they're between 100 and good ones are 500. I personally, I have the Shure 57 for my dynamic mic, which I use for when I do like if I ever get asked to do like a bar gig where I'm playing my electronic setup, and I take my pedal board and my speaker and my tuba, and I'll use my dynamic mic because I need to cut through all the sound. But if I'm recording and if I'm doing stuff for some of the tuba music videos that I do, I'm going to use a condenser mic because I'm going to get a lot more of the deep tones that I want, which makes the mixing process a lot easier for me. The next part, which is also extremely important, are amps. there are a lot of different kinds of amps, and I don't want to recommend any specific one because every person's sound taste is different. The same thing with microphones. Every person's sound taste is different, and you want to make sure that you're testing out and trying everything so that you can get exactly what you're looking for. With amps, I think it's very important that you go for a bass amp. You can get away with doing guitar amps, but again, like it's a guitar amp is much more geared towards higher frequency. Oh, sorry, my hand's getting weird. Much more geared towards higher frequencies, whereas a bass amp is actually, you know, kind of built for the lower frequencies and even sustaining that sort of thing. I use a Fishman Loudbox. It was pretty cheap, I think around 250. And I just literally went into a guitar store, or maybe it was a music and art store, walked in and just said, hey, I have my tuba in the car and my microphone. Can I just sit down and try your stuff? And they said, sure. Like, we haven't heard a tuba player in here ever, so might as well, right? And, you know, it was a lot of fun. I had some guitarists come in and jam with me for a bit, but at the same time, I was working personally on trying to find the right equipment and making sure I could afford it too. So I definitely recommend the Loudbox, but also Fender, Boss, Roland. They all have fantastic products, and you know, depending on your price range, I'm sure you could find something there as well. The next part, and probably the most fun part, are the effects pedals, and we'll get into this more when we talk about like education and performance practices and applications using electronics. But the three main ones that I would like to talk about today are distortion pedals, looping pedals, and polyphonic pitch shift pedals. There are a bunch of different types of these, and again, just like amps and mics, I definitely recommend that you try out your own stuff. I've had a lot of success with Boss products. So if you see here, the loop station is a Boss uh, is Boss Boss RC3 loop station. And I believe this mega distortion here, this isn't my actual pedal, this loop station is, but this pedal here, I believe, is also the Boss mega distortion pedal. And they usually work better for bass instruments. Yeah, it's important to make sure that you find things that are geared towards bass guitar instead of electric guitar, tenor guitar, whatever you want to call it. Just because I think that they're geared more towards our needs, but no one has really made a tuba pedal yet. I might be helping some friends work on that someday, hopefully. We'll see. And then the pitch shift pedal, which is a lot of fun. I have some demonstrations for you. Unfortunately, with everything going on, my equipment was locked up in BU, so I can't do any live things for you. But I do have video from my lecture recital that I gave last year, and I'll do some demonstrations of what kind of things we can do with these and what kind of drills I've done with my students and myself to work on my own fundamental things as well. Let's see. Next, we have, oops, sorry, mouse. This one is a little bit basic as well, but I think it's very important because this is something that I've struggled with learning as well, is the different kind of sound files to use. So basically, MIDI, don't use it if you can help it. It's only really used for notational software, and it's literally just it's the programming that tells your computer what your computer sound card, what noises to make at the correct time. So it doesn't actually have any ability to make good sounds. It just makes electronic representations of the sounds that we're used to. So try not to use that. I don't think you can really convert anything to that. I believe that we're all familiar with MP3, and that kind of revolutionized portable music, and that's basically what we use for file sharing. It's a little bit decompressed, but you get a really good sound out of it, and the quality has gotten a lot better over the years. So I think it's a good way to go. And then the Wave and AIF, which are ones that you see when you save files usually. These are the best kind of files, the most detailed and most musically accurate from what you're rendering, but they're very bulky and they can be hard to store and to send and to share. So those are good for personal use, I would say. If you're saving something to your personal computer and you have a lot of space, go ahead and do that. But I believe the conversion for it is like 4 to 5 minutes of Wave file can take up to, I think it's like 50 megabytes or something like that. So you're dealing with a pretty big file, and if you have multiple of those, you know, you're losing some computer space right there. So just be aware of that, and make sure that you're using the right files and the right kind of saving. And then lastly, on the PowerPoint, before we get to the good stuff, I wanted to talk about DAWs, and we'll get more to this later. I'm going to do a whole little tutorial, I guess, kind of on Logic and show you kind of the things that I've been doing and where I think that electronics can go. So DAWs, digital audio workstation, we have there are many different kinds. The first one, which I believe is still around and I believe people still use quite a bit, is Audacity. It's a free one, very user friendly. I remember back in the day, I used to do my Falcone tapes on Audacity and just making sure that everything was in there and then put a little reverb on it. So, I doctored it a little bit, but it still sounded pretty good. And then we have the two DAWs that are probably like professional grade. Um, Professional grade, they can be a little expensive, but they're also pretty user friendly. Pro Tools and Logic Pro. So Pro Tools is a little bit more expensive, but that's what I learned on after Audacity. So in my master's, I was working a lot with composition, and I wrote a piece that used tube and electronics. And what I did was I went into a recording, or I went into the concert hall, and I took my little Zoom HR3 or whatever it was at the time, and I just put it up beside my tuba and started doing like slap tongue, pitched valve smacks. So I would like have the B flat and I would just smack it on the valve and stuff like that and create the pitch, percussive pitch with the valve. But then I would also like drop the microphone in and play loud, low sustain stuff and create natural distortion, which was a lot of fun and was really useful in the piece that I wrote. And so I definitely recommend using Pro Tools because when I was learning Pro Tools, it was very easy to understand. I mean, there were some things that I had to learn as far as like the plugins and how to properly use filter and becoming a better splicer. But I think that Pro Tools was great and it's really good for schools. If you're doing personal stuff, I would recommend Logic just because it's cheaper. You get a lot more, or you get basically the same stuff as Pro Tools, like a lot of the plugins, the organization. For me, unfortunately I'm very organized now, or I try to be as organized as possible. And Logic really sets it up in a great grid pattern, makes it really easy to do some minute editing, especially on acoustic instruments. And it just sounds cool that I use Logic instead of, I don't know, whatever else. So I feel more like an awesome person.
Let me jump in and say you might have said this, but I can't remember. Logic is an Apple DAW, so you have to be on a Mac for that. The nice thing about it is it looks like GarageBand. So if you've spent time on GarageBand, then the learning curve for jumping into Logic Pro is not too high.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you for bringing. I actually didn't bring that up at all. So yeah, if you're not on Apple, I'm fortunate. All I do is Apple right now. I'm thinking about making some switches over, but that would mean I'd have to switch equipment and stuff. So that's in the future. But yeah, and yeah, that I actually didn't think about that. That Logic is very much so like GarageBand. Like everything about it, even the setup, the interface looks a lot like it at the beginning. And it's, I think it's worth the money that you put down for it if you have the money to do it and if you have the want to do stuff with it. And then the final one that I just wanted to mention, I've never worked with this, but I've listened to house music and stuff like that, is Ableton Live. And if you're familiar at all with like electronic dance music or what, like what's that guy, the guy with the mouse mask, oh no, I forget his name. He's this really famous DJ with is it
Like
not
Dead
Skrillex?
Mouse or something,
That
or
guy,
the
Dead Mouse.
five is the S or something
Oh,
like that.
maybe. Yeah, I think Skrillex also uses Ableton, but Ableton is mostly is really good for electronic music. And if I haven't gotten to use this one as much because I don't really have the money to purchase it and try it. But I haven't heard too much acoustic taping in and then manipulation of acoustic sounds. I've only really heard electronic sounds on that. So that's just one I wanted to bring up, and I've got a friend who does a lot of cool stuff on it, but I haven't gotten to use it yet. So yeah. Are there any questions on that or anything I can clarify in that little part there? No? Sweet. All right. Well, next I wanted to talk a bit about, whoops, let me just get the screen share. There we go. Next, I just wanted to talk a little bit about why or how we can use electronics in an educational way. I think that it's very important that we learn how to use electronics more in the teaching classroom and in our studios now, because I mean, kids are coming up and they're learning how to use iPads. And so I think a good way to keep them engaged and to keep their imagination and creativity going is to introduce electronics in the studio and to really test what they know and what they can do with electronics. So yeah, let's see. Let's dive into the effects pedals. Yeah, that'll be a good place to start. So with effects pedals, the main three that I want to talk about again are distortion, looping pedals, and the polyphonic pitch. And I've got examples that I can show in just a second, but just a quick explanation of the three. So distortion, basically what happens with distortion is you take a sound and then you basically turn the gain all the way up to 11, and it fortifies the sound. It makes the harmonic series on the top part. So if you're playing like a pedal C, it makes the entire harmonic series more audible than it is when you just play the pedal C. The way that I use that is it's a little interesting, but it's kind of worked for me. So what I'll do is, and I'll show the example in a second. I'll play a pedal C and I'll sustain it with the distortion on. And what happens is you can actually hear the upper harmonics. And so when that happens, it's a lot easier for me personally to hear when I'm going out of tune and stuff like that. If my pedal C isn't sustained, those upper harmonics fluctuate quite a bit. And so it's a really good indicator for me, who has a little bit of trouble hearing down there and making sure that my pitch is steady. It's a really good indicator for me exactly what's going on, so I can try to correct that. I'm gonna screen share this real quick. Oh, there we go. Oops, sorry, one sec. Didn't optimize the video. There we go. All right, so this is, sorry for the weird face at the beginning. This is from my lecture recital, I guess December of 2019. It was earlier than that. But so I did basically an entire lecture recital on electronics in the music studio and then I built a curriculum around it, and I presented that to my teachers and the faculty to show them what I thought a classical minded conservatory style teaching, what they could benefit from using electronics and trying to get more pop stuff, I guess, oriented into it, or more modern techniques. And so here's the beginning, and this should be, make sure I've got the right one up. Oops, on paper. Distortion 22, yep, okay. So here we go. And here's an example of the distortion. So already we can hear in the upper harmonics kind of a little dip, and that's because the pitch isn't steady. Now let me show you an exaggerated form of that. And the interesting thing is that when we start to raise the pitch and raise the pitch sharp, that the upper harmonics actually start to go away, which is very interesting. Listen again. And when it's a full round sound and a steady pitch, the whole thing is up. He said it perfectly. I couldn't say it any better. But I think it's very important, at least for me, it was very important to really hear how easily my pitch wasn't as sustained as I wanted it to be. Like how I could really find out what my tendencies were and where my face laxed, I guess, in the process of sustaining a pedal. And that's something that I've taken with me and that I work on every day, is really sustain. I mean, that's the big part of what we do as tuba players and euphonium players, is sustain, and making sure that we can sustain something in tune and with great tone for a long time. The next one that I wanted to talk about is the polyphonic pitch shift. Let's see, that's at 18. This is so weird to watch this again. And so with a polyphonic pitch shift, there are two main different kinds. The one that I'm using, where's the annotate? The one that I'm using down here, I'm not sure if you can see it. behind the thing. It's the eHarmonics Flux pedal. So there are two I guess styles of creation of polyphonic pitch shift devices. There's one that is just you get like just a little box, so it looks more like the distortion pedal box, and you can set the interval that you want it to go to. So if there are two buttons on it, the first button would be on or off. So that means that nothing's happening if the off button is on, if the off button is activated. But the top one would be like a fifth or a third or an octave. And that just means that when you press that, that's what you get. That's the way that the pitch will shift up to a third, up to a fifth, or something like that. And I think some of them you can also do like sub third or sub fifth. The one that I decided to go with has a treadle on it, so you get more of you get the full chromatic spectrum between the octaves, and I can also set the interval on that. So with the one that I have, I believe it's 2 octaves that I have the ability to treadle between, and it goes down to like a second. So if the treadle is all the way activated, if the pedal is all the way pushed down, that means that the pitch is only shifted up to a second or up to a third, up to a fifth, and then the entire length is in between those. Whereas if I have 2 octaves, then I can go, anywhere I really need to. What I found with this is it's really good for ear training. So what I'll have my students do is I'm pretty sure I know I demonstrate it next, but I have my students sustain a pitch, and then with the pitch shift pedal activated, I usually do it at an octave. With it activated, I have them go in between a fifth, a third, and then all the way up to an octave while they're sustaining the pitch. So it works on them on two things really: on sustain, making sure that that fundamental pitch is sustained and solid, but then while they're doing that, they have to use their ears to find where the fifth, the third, and the octave are going to be. And I think that it's a pretty interesting ear training device. And also it helps us to tune down in an area where, my singing voice doesn't go all the way down to a C, or down to, usually not even down to an F below the staff. I've got kind of a tenor voice. So hearing things down there and hearing intonation and chords stacked is kind of difficult for me, but I think that this is a fun way to try it. All right, mouse, boom. My students to do is, by sustaining a fundamental pitch and using their ear, find the notes. And this helps especially with instruments like ours in the lower register, and with basses when they have double stops. It can be very difficult to hear those intervals sometimes in the low register. So working on this where it's so close together, I think, is extremely important, and only helps when the tessitura is higher in the upper harmonics. All right, and then we can stop this. Cool. Yeah. And then, so those are the first two pedals, the polyphonic and the distortion. The last pedal that I wanted to talk about real quickly, and if you'd like, I'd be happy to talk about some other pedals, but I haven't been able to find practical uses for these in education yet. I'm still working on it. And I have a multi-effects pedal that I like to work with as well, which is a lot of fun. But the one that I think is the most applicable to us as teachers is a looping pedal. And so what I found with that, a looping pedal is basically you press the button as soon as you start playing, and you press it as soon as you stop playing. And then it repeats that over and over and over again until you stop it, usually with a double tap, #Zombieland, if anyone has seen Zombieland. No? Ah, man. Darn. Anybody? Yeah? Okay. Anyways, it's a good reference. I liked it.
All the youngins have seen it, but
okay, good.
The old people here have not.
Good. It's rule number 2 in Zombieland. I remember it. So a looping pedal, the way that I found works best is it's actually, I use it as a live recording for a student. So I'll ask them, come in, play your etude. And they'll play their etude. They start it exactly. If it's Bordoni, let's see, number 1, da, 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 whatever my pitch is this morning. Have them play it all the way down. And then as soon as I stop it, the recording starts back up. And so now I can talk with my student about exactly what we're hearing together. So instead of asking them to remember to remember how they played something, or remember like a pitch shift, or like if they missed a note, now I have a live recording of exactly what they just played, and we can talk about it together, and it's going to keep looping and looping so that we can just work on it. And then that way I'm also making sure that my concepts, or the concepts that I revere, are being heard by my students. So sometimes I'm like, I really want to hear this, and they're like, I don't know what that means. Well, now I've got a way to show them. It's also a great way to build creativity in duets. And so when I have a more advanced student who's been doing, I don't know, who's playing out of like the Vern Reynolds book or something like that, I'll be like, okay, let's take it back a step and let's see how your composition skills are, or your arranging skills. And so we'll go back to these Bordonis and I'll say, okay, you know the top part, you can play it well, but let's hear a counter melody part, or let's hear the bass line or something like that. Like I want to hear what else they can do. And so this way they can play the etude down, or they can play a snippet of the etude. Usually it's like the A section or the B section at a time. And then I'll say, okay, play the B, or play the A section, and then do your harmonic or bass line part or whatever you wrote for this week, and let's hear how they fit together, and make sure that the changes are correct, make sure that the ear is correct, and that we're hearing some things. And hopefully they get really creative and a little wacky with it. I had one student come in, and I'm trying to remember which one it was. It was definitely Bordoni. Oh, I forget. He did Bordoni, but he did it in like a Latin groove. Oh, man, it was so cool. It was really cool. I mean, you know, the changes weren't correct, but he still like he grooved with it, so I dug it. And there's actually, I heard one yesterday of a gentleman who created backing tracks for the first 16 Bordonis, I think. And so it's like I have a friend who did them all with metal tracks. So he does his Clark studies with a metal like that sort of thing. But this other guy had like a great 12/8 groove that he did with whichever Bordoni that is. So it's really interesting to hear, like, uh, or to hear people's creativity. I call it hearing people's creativity, because I think that when they arrange it, it's putting it out there for us to listen to it, and that's creativity to me. Yeah. So those are those three pedals. Multi effects pedal. Basically, it combines multiple effects together. So you can get ones that have like a looping side, but then also you can go in between different settings, and they'll have like different versions of distortion, different versions of reverb, and then sometimes you can even go into the program itself. It's a physical box, but sometimes you can go into these programs yourself on the multi effects pedal and actually tinker with it. So I've got a pretty cool, I guess, sound that I found with a good distortion that's kind of based off Jaco Pastorius. So it's like Jaco Pastorius, and it's called Smoky something. Jaco Pastorius and like Smoke on the Water, like that kind of sound. And so I combined those two together and added a little bit of my own, I guess, taste to it within the program, and found a setting that I like a lot. And then I've saved that, and that's my preset kind of, or my standard for bar gigs now, because people always want to hear a funky tuba for some reason instead of a regular one. So, yeah. Um, are there any questions about the effects pedals, or ideas about education with them, or do you want to hear about other effects pedals that there are that I haven't really looked into too much, or anything?
I've got a couple questions. The polyphonic pedal, over Zoom the audio wasn't completely easy to hear, but it's it's stacking another interval, right?
Yeah.
On top
Yep.
of what you're doing. So it's you're hearing the playthrough of what you were playing, plus then it was stacking whatever interval you were adding with the pedal, right?
Uh, kind of. So I think the reason that you're able to, that it sounds like stacking, is because my instrument is acoustic. If you were on a bass guitar and an electric guitar, it would actually change the pitch. But the reason it works so well on tuba is because we've got the acoustic sound, and then this, my part of the sound that's going into the microphone, is what gets manipulated. So that's the stacking effect,
Okay.
which is why it works so well for us.
So the only thing coming out of the speaker was the manipulated pitch.
Right. Yeah. So I guess if you have a way to mute, if you've got like one of the Yamaha brass mutes or something like that, where it's just the microphone speaker set, the only sound that would come out would be the manipulated pitch, and maybe like the dull hum of the pitch that you're playing acoustically. But yeah. Yep.
What is your signal chain? Because when I think about a lot of these pedals, they have a 1/4 inch in.
Mhm.
So, but you're using a microphone, so you've got an XLR cable. How are you feeding that into these boxes?
Right. So I do. I have XLR to male, and so it's an XLR 1/4 inch just combination, and then on my pedal board I just have 1/4 inch linked across, and 1/4 inch into my amp as well. So it's 1/4 inch except for the mic, which is XLR cable. Um, Trying to think. I need to play around with doing just to see what the sound would be. But so my, I guess the order that I normally go in, if I'm using my full pedal board, would be microphone, which is going into my looping pedal, and then the looping pedal goes into the multi effects. Or if I have a different pedal with me, that's what happens next. Because I usually want to do the loop first, and then get the effect on top of it, and then the last pedal, either the multi effects or the distortion or the phaser or whatever, goes directly into my amp, and then that's what comes out of the sound. That's just the way that I guess I started doing it, and that it's been working best for me. But there's some friends who are guitar players have told me about different setups and stuff like that, and the hardest thing personally for me, the hardest thing with technology is that there's so much of it and it's always changing all the time. So there's always a better version of what you have. So I'm like, oh man, like I don't want to spend that kind of money, but it would be better and easier. But it's always back and forth. So yeah.
Do you guys have any questions? I got a couple more, but I don't want to take the floor. So, how, um, when did you get your feet wet with this? Is this something you were dabbling with before IUP, during IUP, after IUP? Like, what was your gateway into joining up electronics with tuba?
Yeah. I didn't start. I don't believe I started working on this until the summer directly after I graduated from IUP. So it was like basically a couple weeks later. I was fortunate enough to get called up to do my hometown had just started doing this live music on the streets, on the blocks and stuff like that. And so they had heard that I was a musician, and there aren't a lot of musicians from my town. So they're like, hey, would you want to, put a group together? And I was thinking a lot about how, like, what kind of group was it going to be? A brass quintet? Was it going to be anything else? Was it just going to be solo tuba? And at the time, I didn't have too many ideas, but I had played quite a bit of jazz, and I had been doing some combo stuff. So what I ended up doing is, I'm not sure if you remember Austin Beaufort, trombone player. Yep. So he's from a town very close to me, and what I ended up doing was I got him. So I had a trombone, a drummer, myself, and then a ukulele player, and we just did like real book charts for about an hour or two on the streets just to hang out, and people would come by and listen, or they would walk by and honk the horn or something like that. And so the way that I kind of got into it was a mixture of, there was a video that Dr. Collins, you showed me, of this Norwegian tuba player with a rock band, I think. And I forget his name and I forget what band it was, but he was playing with distortion or some sort of effects pedals. And that got the wheels turning. And then I had this opportunity to play music outside with an instrument that isn't super loud on the streets. Like, it gets kind of buried underneath the rustle and bustle. And so I bought an amp, and I bought my first, I think I bought my looping pedal maybe a month after that, after the first gig with those guys. And then the way that I got my feet wet into all of the pedals was I started just listening. I'm a big fan of Victor Wooten, and he had this amazing version of "Isn't She Lovely," where he does it's just him on bass, and I think it's just him and looping pedal, but he has one other pedal, but you can't see the floor. You can only see the top part of him. So I'm not sure what all his equipment was. But I started hearing stuff like that, and I was like, man, I want to copy that. Like, I want to be able to do his version of "Isn't She Lovely" on my tuba. And so I did it. I started working on it with looping pedal, and then I started getting the crazy ideas of like, now what would happen if I had the bass line sound more like a synth? And I was like, so what would I need to do to get that? And I was like, maybe distortion, maybe an effects pedal. And that's when I started going to the guitar centers and the music and arts and just playing around and just asking, like, I've got all my equipment in the car. Can I just sit around and try some stuff? And they were like, if you buy something, I was like, well, I need valve oil anyways, so might as well. Yeah. And then I guess like I think either my first or second recital at ECU, my master's, I started performing with them, like my own arrangements and stuff like that. So with the looping pedal, it was basically like I wanted an excuse to not just play classical music. Like I love all of the, or not all of them, but I love a lot of the solo rep that we have, like the Gregson, not so much, but a lot of the others I really enjoy. But I wanted to find a way to add some of my own music to it. And I wasn't really, I'm still not a composer, but I at least have had more time now than I did before. And so I wanted to add my own music in there, and I could at least improvise enough to get me through playing like 5 minutes in front of an audience. So that's when I started forcing myself to do it. It was mostly just about ripping off the band-aid and saying like, hey, I'm going to do this and I got to practice it. And you know, with the looping pedals especially, if you've ever recorded yourself, which I'm sure many of you have, you know that the first time listening to yourself is like, oh, that's what I sound like, or oh man, time was there, or that intonation, like, oh man. So it was very much so with the looping pedals, like, you know, it's gonna be bad for the first couple times, but the more you do it, the better you get with the more you listen back and understand what's going on with your own playing. That's when it gets better. And for me, in lieu of recording myself in a hall, the looping pedals have been probably what I do the most as far as like listening to myself and hearing what I do, which is why I think they're so useful in teaching. Maybe I'm just biased, but I think that they're really good for that. Any other questions? Oh, awesome. Well, let's talk. So I think we talked quite a bit about the performance side, just in that little bit, the performance side of using effects pedals. I kind of want to get into talking about like where I think things are going next and what I'm personally doing now. With all the time that with all the time that has been given to us, I've, you know, I've been trying to keep myself busy, and of course I practice, but I've also been trying to find ways to enhance my musicianship. So whether it's arrange, I set an hour away for arranging every other day. I'm listening constantly. I'm working with these effects pedals, but also I've been trying to find some multimedia ways to get to work. Um, I was born in the '90s, and most of you were as well. Or are you guys all thousands? Thousands.
2000.
Oh no. Wait, did you grow up with MTV? Anybody? No,
I think it was around, but I
not
didn't.
so much. Okay.
I
Well,
was
back.
born in the 1900s,
So you remember MTV?
back when they played music.
Okay. Oh, on MTV before they went to all the.
Before it was reality television.
Yeah, yeah. Oh man. Well, I grew up at the very just before it became reality television, and so I always like every morning I remember waking up and like going down, and my parents didn't watch anything because they were either out at work or they were getting ready for the day. So I would just sit down, and while I was waiting for the bus, I would watch MTV videos, which is music television videos. It was basically like all the songs that you hear on, uh, you know, on the radio today, but they had better production. You got to hear the entire song. So, you know, nowadays they have to kind of edit the songs for radio format and make them a little bit shorter. But with the music videos, they would actually like play the entire song, and they would have either really cool or really weird or really bad videos that went along with these. And so I really enjoyed those, and I kind of missed them. And I started thinking like, what would happen if I tried to do it myself? Like, what if I did like tuba music videos? And so something that I've been working on recently is I bought a program called Logic, the one that we were talking about earlier. And I also bought this really interesting, or not bought, this one was actually free, a very interesting program called DaVinci Resolve. And that's a video editing software program. So basically what I was able to do and what I've been doing the past, I guess, 4 weeks is I do an arrangement. And so the first week it was Sweet Dreams by the Eurythmics, which had a great music video if you've ever heard it. This past one that I just did on my own was Wonderwall by Oasis, which is like that '90s song that every, you know, sappy love movie uses when the guy's trying to get the girl at the end, or vice versa, whatever it is. They hold up the boombox and it's like, "Today is gonna be the day, so I'm coming back to you." all that kind of stuff. And I wanted to like make fun of it and play it on tuba. But I also wanted to make it like I didn't want to just have music, and I'm not a good enough videographer or animator or anything like that to do anything else. So I just decided to get this resolve and then do some personal filming and then try to make a storyline around the music that I was producing. So for me, it's been really a fun creative avenue, just something to keep my mind off of only practicing or um, only doing whatever else I do. It's a way to kind of combine a bunch of things that I try to work on every day into one thing. And so it's helped me a lot with my arranging chops. You know, trying to arrange pop songs for tuba isn't always the easiest. You got to work with a lot of you got to find a lot of ways to be creative with how you arrange it, especially voicing wise. Because I mean, I'll do like between 6 to 8 voices at a time, and so yeah, when you get the full thing going, it's kind of rough. But but this whole process has helped me a lot with understanding exactly what I need to work on every day. And so a big part of this has been when I'm done a recording session, I usually do my recording in the evening and I'll do my fundamentals and stuff during the day. The recording session the night before dictates what I work on the next day in my routine. So I mean, I've got my like first 20 minutes is what I always do, like my routine. But then if there were like if my articulation was bad the night before or my intonation in B flat wasn't as good as I want it to be, then the next day that's all I'm doing after my first 20 minutes is I'm just working on how can I make my articulation better, doing drills like that. And then instead of tuning myself in C, I'll tune myself in B flat or I'll tune myself in F sharp or wherever the intonation was really rough. I'll work in that key for that whole day basically before I do the recordings that night. Um, that has helped me a lot to learn how to practice better, I think, because when I was in Boston, there's not a lot of opportunity to practice, unfortunately, and there's not a lot of space to practice. And so when you get a chance, when you have gigs at 8 a.m. in the morning, 2 hours away, which is actually 10 miles away because that's how traffic works up there, it's like, you know, you're leaving at 6. You probably haven't gotten a chance to warm up properly. You're doing some buzzing in the car, but I can't play trumpet or I can't play tuba like the trumpet players do in their car. So it's kind of rough. And then you just show up and play the gig. And so I was really lacking on getting my kind of practice time in, the practice time that I really wanted. And so these recording projects have been a great way to get me back into shape and to get my ear back around where I want it to go. So I wanted to show you guys a little bit of Logic, and let me make sure I've got up here. Where you at? Chrome. Oops. There you are. Okay. So this is Logic, and it's again, it looks very similar to maybe not similar, but it's basically the same setup as what you'll see in like Audacity or Pro Tools or GarageBand and something like that. And so what I wanted to show you guys was a little bit of what the recording process takes. Starting off with like the bare minimum. So when I'm doing these kind of videos and when I'm making my own content, and actually this is kind of a lie because what I'm doing right now is if you guys know Anthony Achille, he was an alumnus of IUP and works in DC now with one of the ceremony. I always forget which band it is. It's like Commandant's or Commandant's Own. Yeah. And he to I'm not sure if he wants to say it, but I think he's a great arranger. And I think he's got some really good chops, and he always like, oh, you know, it's just another arrangement. I don't want to hear it. But I kind of convinced him to send me his arrangement of Robin Hood, which was Robin Hood Prince of Thieves, which was a cinematic movie, maybe early 2000s or late 90s, something like that. It's not the one it's not the Men in Tights, unfortunately. I wish he had the theme to that, but it's the other one. And so it's let's see, it's 8 parts, 4 tuba, 4 euphonium. And what I asked was like, hey man, send me the score audio or the MIDI, and then I'm going to record the tuba parts and send them to you, and you can record the youth parts. And then that way you've got a file to send to, or to have in case anyone wants to purchase yourself or in case you want to publish it. Because I think, again, I think he's got some really good arranging chops. So what I wanted to show you guys with this is just a little bit about how it works. So on the screen in front of you are the tracks that I have. I've got the score audio up top, which, here, let me just play a little bit of it for you, just so you can hear what I'm working with.
Just so you know, the audio is not coming through on our side.
Oh, it's not? Oh,
I had trouble with this trying to show somebody a DAW a while back. I wonder if there's something in the settings. I couldn't get Adobe Audition to share audio either, so you may
Oh,
not.
settings in the DAW. Okay.
Maybe you might see if Zoom is an output.
Yep, sure is. Okay. Let's see if, is that better? Cool. So basically my recording process is, or at least the way that has worked best for me so far, is that I'll take the MIDI, and with my arrangements as well, I'll take the MIDI and I'll import it directly into my DAW, into Logic. And then that's my backing track. So that way, and I'll turn, if you can get the annotate up here. There we go. If you see up in this corner where my annotate thing is, there's a metronome button. And so, there we go, metronome. So if I turn it on, you've got the click track behind you, and I've also got the MIDI going on. And so my process is I start out with those, and I usually record not the bottom tuba part, but usually there's a tuba part that's doubled, so the octave above tuba part, and that's the one that I actually do a thing where I take one set of my headphones off and then stick another earphone in that's connected to my to my to my cell phone, where I've got a drone going on just whatever pitch the song is in. So in this case, it's in B flat. So I've got one side on, one side off with a drone, and then I can hear both the MIDI and the metronome in my right ear, and I'm playing at the same time. Once I get, usually, so in this case, it was tuba 3. Once I get that one done, then I go down to the bottom part, and I'll get the tuba, then I go up and I find if there's a voice that usually resides in like the 5th to octave area, or if there's like a counterpoint that works out well. And then I'll kind of work there, because I want to really set up the basis for my intonation throughout the entire thing. And I find that if I just work on the fundamental pitches, if I work on the fundamental pitches first, sometimes it doesn't reflect the upper harmonies that I want to make pop out from this. And so what I'll show you guys is just kind of what the master has, or sorry, the master mix, I'm not the master, what the master mix sounds like. So again, we're going from MIDI, and then once I get to about the second or third track, that's when I turn the MIDI off, and I'm just working off the balance from the recorded stuff. And I think it's very important that when you're doing this, and we haven't talked about this yet, but if you can see down here, I've got my mixing board. And I think it's very important, if you see here, these are all the audio effects and the plugins. These are what I'm going to use for final production. But for recording, I think it's extremely important to have those completely off, because what you want to do is you want to match exactly what's coming out of what you're hearing from yourself being recorded over and over again. It's not the prettiest sound, but I think it's important to match that first and make sure that everything in there is clean and tidy. And then when you go into the effects, everything just sounds way better. I found that if you do it with the effects on first, you might get a little bit better sustain from yourself, but the sound is usually warped enough that it can be issues with articulation, especially for fast passages, sometimes intonation as well. So I'll play a little bit of it without the mix on, of the 4 parts that I've recorded thus far, which I'm hoping to send out to him tomorrow, I think. I think that's what I told him. Oops, let me make sure I'm at the right place here. There we go. Cool. And so this is what it sounds like dry. And so the reason I do it that way is so that, again, when I go into the effects, everything just sort of pops out. So for me personally, for the sounds that I want, I found that let's see, how do I want to type this? I've found that it's best to go to add reverb and stuff like that, to add anything like any sort of reverb or things that can happen to the entire mix to the actual stereo output. So here where my mouse is, you can see that I've got two effects. I've got a channel EQ, which is basically, it tells what pitches to bring out or sorry, what frequencies to highlight or to diminish. And so with tuba, I found that with recording with the mic that I have, I found that I need to turn down the higher frequencies and kind of boost up the lower frequencies, because again, that's where my tuba resides, down in the mid to lower frequencies for the channel EQ. And then I found this really cool plugin called what's it called? Space something. Does it even have a name? Maybe it doesn't. It's just called Space on mine. And so what this does is it kind of like sets up the reverb or the room, like basically the reverb of the room that I want it to sound like. And I'll turn this on. Actually, I'll turn on all the plugins, and you're going to hear the sound change completely. But one thing that I do want to bring up that I found helped a lot, and I just figured this out a couple days ago, was adding a compressor to each one of the tuba tracks. What a compressor does is it basically, if you think of a pitch, here, let's bring this up. Let's find a good example. Here we go. So you see where my mouse is on this single pitch? It's got kind of like a triangle, or like you can see that the front of it is a little bit bigger than the bottom. What a compressor does is it goes from this and just evens it out. So it's more of a block sound, right? So it takes the articulation, the dynamic of the articulation or the front of the pit of the sound, and it kind of evens it out across the entire duration of the pitch that's happening. And
I got a couple questions on that.
yeah.
So are you using a preset? Is there a particular compressor setting that you recommend? And also, it seems like you recommend this on each track rather than on the final track, right? On the output.
I think so. I mean, I guess you could do it either if it's the same compressor setting for each one of, if the same compressor setting works for each of the voices, I would say put it at stereo just to make it clean and just to make sure everything's lined up that way. But for me, I've got different compressor settings for each one. And that's just because if with my screen, there's a lot of different things to I guess tinker with and mess. And I have them change slightly between the bottom voices and the F tuba voices, the C tuba and the F tuba voices. And I've been playing around with it a lot, so maybe I'll go back and just say, you know what, just one compressor for the whole thing. But the sound setup that I have now, I kind of like, at least for this particular track. And I think that's another important point, is that at least in my opinion, each recording is like a clean slate. And I don't think I think there's some presets that you can have that go across recordings. But I mean, Robin Hood is completely different than the sound space that I wanted for Wonderwall or the sound space that I wanted for Sweet Dreams. And so each time I've changed the compressor settings, the EQ, each one. But again, I also save those presets so that if I were able to use those presets again, I have them because I like them so much. But yeah, if you have the same compressor or the same effect that works across all four voices, I think that's when you put them in the stereo sound. But if you're looking for a more individual sound, because there are some people out there who do like 3 reverbs per one voice, like they'll have multiple reverbs on their kick set or something like that, and they get really into it. So I haven't gotten that far yet, fortunately, but yeah. And so this is the compressor setting, just so you can see what it looks like. Again, there's a lot of stuff to mess with, and I usually set about, each night I give myself between 30 and an hour to just tinker around. So like I'll do recordings from the previous set and just like put them into a throwaway file and just mess around with it, make it sound bad, make it sound good, and then make it sound in between, and see or make it sound amazingly good, and then find where it works best. And so let me show you what it sounds like now with all these on. So I've got, on the stereo side, I've got the channel EQ, which again lets you, I guess, decide what frequencies are more present. I've got the space, which is kind of like says the amount of reverb or what kind of room you're recording in. So this one sounds kind of like a really wet hall, really live space. And then I've got my four compressors, which again, the F tubas and the C tubas are a little bit different, but they're mostly the same. And this is what the mix sounds like as of now. I really like this part. Sorry, he's got some good pedal points in there that I like to play. So this is like the final mix that I want or sorry, the final soundscape that I want to produce in. I think it's very important to do all the recording and all the layering without any effects on, and I also think that it's important, or I guess it's not important, but this is just like a little tip that I learned recently, to do everything with a plug-in headset. If you start working with Bluetooth, especially on this, there's stuff with latency happens, and then all the metronomic stuff gets way out of whack, and it's very frustrating. And I've got a really good pair of headphones that that are Bluetooth. They're like Bose or whatever they are. They're great, but I was using them and I was getting really good sounds in, but wasn't lining up. So I went to my dad's old podcast stuff and started working with that. I'm trying to think. I think there was one more thing that I wanted to talk about with this. Are there any questions? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say, I know some people might have some things to get some classes at 11 anyway, so this might be a good time to ask for any final questions,
Yeah, please.
especially Evan, the talkative one.
Yeah.
Well, one thing that I do want to point out is that a lot of this stuff was done out of necessity. Like you kind of put yourself out there. You did a gig in your hometown, and so that gave you a reason to figure this stuff out. Or you put something on a recital, and it gave you a reason to figure this stuff out. So that's been my experience with it as well. Whether it's learning a piece of hardware or software. Is just create a project, and it'll give you something to work towards and figure this stuff out. And you'll find that it's very useful. And once you have the skills, it opens up some opportunities for you, whether that's in your next job or your ability to get a job. It's really nice to build these skills, and you're not going to build them just in theory, like, oh, I'm going to learn logic. You'll learn logic if you create a project that causes you to learn logic, or you decide that, okay, I'm going to do something on my recital with live looping. Otherwise, you're not really going to learn it, but it'll give you a reason to learn it. So I'd encourage you all to, if there's something out there that interests you, just make yourself do it. Like, say, I'm going to make a YouTube video of me doing this thing, and that'll, encourage you to do it instead of just saying, well, yeah, this summer I'm going to try to learn this or that. You probably won't unless you have a thing to work towards.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that if I could leave anyone with advice, just you're going to fail and fail a lot. And it's good because failure is a learning experience. So as soon as you fail, you just reflect upon it. And we're our own best teacher. And so I think that every person has the soundscape that they want in their head. Like they know exactly how they want it to sound. And so when you put yourself out there and you fail a bunch, that gets you closer to your overall goal. So failure is good. Just keep failing. As long as you learn after it. Yeah.
That is very good advice. Well, Zach, thanks for giving us your time and for putting all these materials together. The stuff that he used up front, the PowerPoint, I put that on Slack for you guys. So if you need to refer back to any of those or you want to get ideas on pedals that you could research. That's all in the files that were on Slack this morning. And I'll put this video up as well. So thanks, Zach, and thanks to you guys for getting up and joining this morning.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you guys so much. It's great to see you all again.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Yep. See you later.